Welcome to Your Education Matters, now in our 6th year as a source of information about British Columbia education. Your Education Matters features the voices of professional educators and other education stakeholders. Today our guest is Michael McEvoy, President of the BC School Trustees Association. Mr. McEvoy is a native of Winnipeg and earned his law degree at the University of Manitoba. Married with 2 children who attended the Victoria schools, President McEvoy was an officer in his PAC and DPAC before serving for 10 years on the Victoria Board of Trustees, including as its chair. He is a recent campaign chair of the United Way of Greater Victoria. Mr. McEvoy is Assistant Commissioner in the BC Office of the Information and Privacy Commissioner. Michael is now in his 2nd term as President of the BC School Trustees Association, representing the trustees of all 60 school boards in the province. We are pleased to welcome Michael McEvoy to Your Education Matters. Thank you for thinking about Your Education Matters. Michael, to get the big picture in mind a little bit, I wanted to ask you if you think the 60 school board system is secure, when it was last changed, and whether you think we have about the right balance of number of school boards to number of students and towns in the province.
Well, I'm smiling because it seems that seems to be a perennial discussion, and especially when we have changes in provincial government about what the right number is. The executive summary answer to your question is I think we probably have the number about right now. I think what matters to trustees around the province is we want to make sure that the scale that we operate at is delivering the best possible education to kids. So certainly trustees are not adverse to discussing with the provincial government if a district or 2 requires amalgamation or perhaps even separation, if that makes sense from an educational point of view. We went through, the last time we went through any kind of amalgamation was in the mid-1990s under the New Democratic Party government. And I would say, I think it's fair to say it was a very stressful event for education in British Columbia. School boards were reduced from, I think it was about 80 some odd to what is now 60. I would say, based on my travels around the province, that we're still feeling some of the effects of that amalgamation process. So it seems to be no evidence that it would necessarily lead to greater efficiencies or savings in the system. Again, I think from our perspective, the focus has to be on what's the best system is to deliver education for our kids.
Well, dollar savings and efficiency is usually the reason given for amalgamation. Is there another reason that's out there?
Well, that seems to be, but there seems to be little evidence to actually support that happening. In a couple of cases, a case can be made potentially that the synergies of 2 areas would create a better education for kids, greater opportunities for sports or sort of a critical mass for more specialty programs, that kind of thing. And again, trustees are not adverse to looking at that, but what has to happen is that has to be in close consultation with local communities and with the provincial government and school boards to make it really viable and appropriate.
Well, the power to do this, of course, rests in the hands, I suppose, of the Legislative Assembly. But in general, in the functioning of our schools, how do you feel about the distribution of power between the ministry and the boards? There is a balance there and a push-pull, I notice.
Absolutely, and we would describe the relationship between boards and the provincial government as one of co-governance. And I think it's also fair to say that there's, I think, some creative tension, if I can describe it that way, between the 2 sectors. So when we say co-governance, that's part of the School Act. The province sets the big picture outcomes that we want to see for all kids in British Columbia in the broadest way. And I would say that trustees also have a say in working with the government on that. But in terms of delivering those programs at a local level, at managing the system, that's done at a local level by trustees who are accountable, elected in their local communities. And I think that's probably one of the major reasons why we have such a successful educational system in British Columbia. The system we've had in place now for probably well over 100 years has worked. I think that balance, at times that balance maybe has gotten out of whack over the last century, but by and large I think it's working pretty well. It's not to say there are not some tensions and not some differences of opinion that exist between boards and the provincial government, but I think in a democracy that's perfectly healthy, and it adds, I think, hopefully something to the system.
Well, there are probably some tensions over funding. So perhaps as an example, you could talk about one of the funding issues that are present in the minds of the trustees.
Sure. Funding has evolved in this province over the course of the last 100 years. It used to be that funding for boards was done at a very local level. Boards taxed at a local level, but that has now evolved over 100 years, where the province basically supplies all of the money from the central treasury to school boards, essentially, not completely, but on a per student basis. That has caused some tension, probably more over the last 20 years in particular, where boards need obviously funds to operate, pay the salaries, do all those kinds of things, and sometimes that funding is not up to what it needs to be. I think actually right now we're in a situation where we have some real pressures to make sure our pension fund for our teachers is sustainable. We're going to have to be adding money to that pot. We have the conversion back to the provincial sales tax, which is going to cost money. We have the medical services plan. All of these kinds of things add to the costs of boards. So when the public hears that the province has maintained funding for education, perhaps at the same level, you can easily understand at that point it's not really keeping funding at the same level, because we have to find that money for those additional costs somewhere. Boards now operate on, we manage our money very carefully, and we're now at a point where, for example, the pension money and all that has to come out of our budget, and it's going to touch the classroom. So as an organization, BCSTA, we are constantly advocating for better and more funding over a range of programs, not just the ones I've talked about here. But that's part of what we do on behalf of school boards. But ultimately, it's on behalf of students, because that's where it counts.
Well, there seems to be expectations creep upward in many of our institutions. I know working at the university, for example, we have great recreational facilities, and when I was a student, there were no significant recreational facilities. We have great job training and career centers, and many things that universities have added didn't exist. And so what we think of as a public school or a proper public university, the expectations have increased, and so there needs to be more money for it, I think.
Yeah, and it's not, you've talked about some of the programs at that level, and at school level, expectations are changing too. Technology is changing a lot of what we do in society, and schools need to keep up with that. Technology provides tools for our kids. That's not the be-all and end-all, but I mean, increasingly, that's the world we're operating in. You also have all kinds of programs that we want to make sure we keep kids in school. It's not one size fits all anymore. So we have a range of academic academies, sports academies, trades that we want to make sure that we're training kids for the future. And all of those kinds of programs, those come with a cost. But they're important. If we want to invest in our province and make sure that we're going to have a sustainable future here, we need to be investing in those kinds of things.
Well, in the past, we wrote off a lot of kids too, or we expected that they'd quit school and go to work in the resource industry, wouldn't need a high school, certainly wouldn't need university education. And now we're not so ready to do that.
Well, and for good reason. You look at what's happening demographically in this province. We are an aging population. We're going to need every single student to graduate from our schools and make sure that they are productive citizens if we are going to be a sustainable society in the long term. So we can't afford to be, I would say not long ago, 25, 30 years ago, the term was side-dooring kids. Perhaps, you know, if you weren't doing well in grade 10 or 11, you could go out in the woods and make 20 bucks an hour. That doesn't exist anymore. And so we have to make sure that we are each of our kids is fulfilling their potential, and to make sure they're engaged with school. And that poses a lot of challenges, but we know more about how to keep kids engaged. We know more about how the brain works and learns, and that's part of making sure that we're creating the culture and climate in our school districts where teachers are as well being trained in that, so we're keeping our kids in school.
So have the school trustees through their association attached a number to this, or a percentage of shortfall that they think exists in terms of provincial funding?
Well, I mean, there's some immediate numbers when I think about this year. The costs associated with some of those short-term items, pensions and so forth, runs somewhere approximately $40 to $60 million. But it's more than that, obviously. There are a range of issues. Kids with learning challenges, I don't think it's any secret, the rates of autism and so on are rising. and a range of other learning needs that our kids have, those take additional resources. And so is there a precise number? We're talking obviously likely in the hundreds of millions, but you have to look at things at a local level and look at the needs of each individual boards and districts. And
I know you're also concerned with restrictions on the money as it comes to you, the targeting of funding. Do you want relief in that area?
Well, I think it's actually probably gotten better over the last 10 or 15 years. The money tends to be less targeted. I think the concern is the general dollar amount that's the major concern. But there's some areas where what I would say in general is that we believe local school boards are in the best position to make use of the dollars they have. They know where their needs are. They know precisely what needs to be addressed in their district. And so we want to give the maximum flexibility for boards working with their administration to make sure those dollars are put in the right place.
Well, you've brought that up twice, and so it makes me wonder specifically, could you give an example of where boards don't have the latitude that they'd like to have to spend the money that's coming to them? I think it would help us understand more clearly what you mean.
Well, I think I would say in general, there used to be a time when money would be targeted, for example, to individual facilities, to individual groups of students. But I would have to say in general terms that has improved. And I think that has been less, again, I'll come back to the point, it's been less of a concern for trustees over the last 5 to 10 years and more about the dollar amounts that the system is receiving.
Okay. So you feel the flexibility's been increased.
Yes.
The issue has become more a matter of the gross amount of money that's coming to you.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we'll pick this up in a moment.
Yeah.
I'm ready. I want the adventure. I saw an SFU presentation back in my high school in Italy, and after a lot of research, I decided to enroll in the mechatronics program. And you know what? 3 years later, here I am working on my robots. Being in a cohort program such as Tech1 was a great opportunity to make friends, and some of those friendships are still lasting nowadays. I think it's really important to try things out before you actually commit to them. And my co-op experience really helped me decide what I was going to do in life. SFU is not only a place where you learn, but also a place where you can share ideas and really grow as an individual. In my first year, I was looking for clubs at SFU, and I found Engineers Without Borders. It really changed my perspective on things, and after that, I also ended up changing my major. So now I'm in my 3rd year in engineering physics, and after taking a TA position, I really discovered a love for teaching. What I want in my life is really more than just work. I want to take on some projects in Latin America, I want to travel, and I definitely see teaching in my future. A complete life.
Michael, in your role with the School Trustees Association, I wonder if you could help us understand the degree to which partisan politics influences our public school decision-making, as opposed to the ideal, I suppose, which would be that those decisions get made on the merits.
I would say, generally speaking, I see actually very little evidence of partisan politics at local school board level. I think, people come to school boards from a range of political backgrounds and views, but my experience is that most people, when they get to the table, take off those hats and focus on ensuring that the kids are well educated. So that's, I think that's a very positive thing. I think the public is reassured by the fact that trustees, generally speaking, act and conduct themselves that way. We live in a very political province. I come from Manitoba, where things tended to be, I grew up there, where things were perhaps a little more moderate and maybe not so polarized as they are in British Columbia. But that's part of democracy, and that's kind of a bit of the overlay in British Columbia that perhaps education at a more provincial level tends to be a little more politically charged. But certainly at the local level, trustees are really focused, I think, in a very nonpartisan way on the students.
And how about the relationship between the trustees and the ministry? Has that been similarly protected from partisanship?
Oh, I think there's always some element of politics involved. You know, sometimes when a provincial government has a particular agenda, and I say this without regard to party, because all parties do, and that's their prerogative. They get elected on the basis of perhaps wanting to do something in particular for education. And how that happens or how that is brought down to a local level is often a matter of discussion, and sometimes tense discussion between local boards in the province. But that, again, is part of democracy. People elect a provincial government that has an agenda. People elect local school boards with an agenda. Somewhere in between, though, what the public expects is that both parts of this co-government structure sit down and make sure they're doing the right thing for our children.
And how about the Trustees Association access to the other stakeholder groups and to the ministry and to being a part of the decision-making process? How well is that working?
I think in recent terms, actually, that has actually been pretty good. It's varied over the years, but I think it's something that the BC School Trustees Association are constantly pushing. I meet frequently, our board meets frequently with the Minister of Education. We meet frequently with representatives of the ministry to talk about issues. There are times when we are taken by surprise on issues. That happens from time to time, and we talk to the ministry about ensuring that we respect one another's roles and that we consult one another, and I think the public expects no less of us.
There are a couple of scheduled meetings that occur, Educational Advisory Council and, for a while anyway, the Learning Roundtable. Yes. What's an update on the status of those two groups?
Well, they haven't been meeting as frequently, I think, as most of us would like. There have been a range of issues which have, I think, perhaps caused that. We had, as the public will know, a collective bargaining dispute not long ago that seemed to disrupt some of these kind of discussions that were happening around the partnership table. So my hope and expectation, having now put some of that behind us, is that we're able to meet on a more frequent basis and discuss the issues that are common. I mean, I think you know, most of us understand that we've got to move the education agenda in the province, but it can't happen unless people are cooperating.
Matter of concern to people, you know, obviously if we're not meeting, if our representatives aren't meeting, then there's not much chance for exchange of ideas and reaching compromise. Your organization's also involved in something you call the Me Too campaign that has to do with politics in a very constructive way. Would you talk about that?
And in a very nonpartisan way. We have a provincial election coming up, and that is affording the BC School Trustees a real opportunity to shine a light on public education in this province and the importance of public education for the future of the province. And so the Me Too campaign is expressing the value of public education, and we want people to share their ideas with us and say, here's why I support public education as well. We want to be taking the message to every town hall, every all candidates meeting, to the caucuses of all the parties, and most importantly to the public, to talk about these issues. Some of us take for granted the fact that public education is a priority. It ought to be and should be, but we shouldn't take it for granted. And the only way political parties will make it a priority is if they believe the public thinks it's important. That's why we need the discussion, particularly leading up to an election, and that's what the Me Too campaign is about. Media
in the province, and what advice you could give on trying to follow education issues and be informed about our public schools. What sorts of media do you access in order to keep yourself informed?
Well, it's in the modern age of the blogosphere and all that. I follow, there's lots of people I follow on Twitter educational experts that I respect, and that can often lead, for those interested in some of the leading edge and interesting articles, that can lead you to that kind of a place. I use Twitter myself to get messages out to the vast array of people that will follow me. Facebook, all of these kinds of tools I think are great for communicating in this age. But still the traditional methods of television, for example, the print media, those are ways that trustees and others can have conversations with the public about issues that need to be looked at. You know, it's unfortunate in some ways, and I think trustees will tell you this around the province, that it's often those tough issues that tend to get the most coverage, school closures, those kinds of things. There's so many good things going on in our public schools right now, and they say good news doesn't often make the news, but those are really important stories because those are successes that kids are having every day, and the public needs to know more about it. It's ironic that we have one of the best public education systems in the world by any measure, by PISA and so forth. And yet the public perception in British Columbia of our system is something that's not aligned with the reality. I think sometimes we spend a little bit too much time, and everybody has to take responsibility for this, trustees included. We may beat up on each other a little bit too much, or you know, talk about the woes of the system, perhaps, and we've talked a little bit about some of those issues today, but when you look at it in its totality and in some perspective, we have a very good public education system. Can it be better? Yes. It can be better with greater resources, but it's a very good system, and the public needs to know that.
Well, I'm very sympathetic to your point of view there. I saw it happen in my own home state of Ohio, which had really quite an admirable education system, but when the global education reform movement swept over everything, we found ourselves adopting measures that were used in Texas and Arkansas, which were lousy, to put it frankly. And they imposed those kind of structures on a school system that really deserved much better because it had better staffing and a better tradition. And I agree with you about BC. By any objective measures, it's one of the finest public school systems you can access. And in my experience of being in 5 states before I came here, I can attest to that. The schools here are inspirational to go into, especially the elementary schools. I find very moving to see the kind of climate that's been created here.
Yes, and I think we talked about the local nature of school boards because, and what that's helped to do is to generate a lot of interesting programs at a local level, which, if successful, you know, can be shared between districts, can be shared. And the province is now, we're working with the province to kind of highlight some of and focus on some of those programs that seem to be working. Now, it's not one size fits all, and you can't adopt them, as you say, completely in another place, but you can adapt them and look for ways to succeed. So through things that are hatched in individual local areas, you know, an educational program in Haida Gwaii is going to look different from something in downtown Vancouver with good reason. That's why we have locally elected boards, so that schools are responsive to their communities, meeting their needs, whether it's trades or you know, I think of in Victoria, for example, we live next to the ocean. One of our high schools started a marine biology program, which is just taken in a number of kids who are fascinated by that, and there we have this resource right at the doorstep. That's not a program that's going to work in Grand Forks necessarily, who have other things adapted to their local communities. That's the beauty of having locally elected and accountable boards.
Well, again, I'm very sympathetic to that. I think whenever possible, you build the schools up from the grassroots. And if you have the human capital in a catchment, you bring the schools up through that. There are occasions where you don't have that due to poverty or something, and then you might have to bring more structure from above. But if the community has the resources to generate its public schools, that should be the default, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And from the perspective of trustees, and what every trustee looks for in their own district, is to try and create a culture and a climate where you talk about that innovation, the kinds of things that are happening in the classroom. We want to create the supports for our teachers to be able to do those kinds of things. Again, that takes resources. That's not an inexpensive thing to do. Teachers, you know, it can be a lonely life living, you know, in your classroom all day, and so to create the opportunities for teachers to interact, for the kind of not just a one-shot professional development, but ongoing professional development. That takes resources. But for trustees, I think that's where a big priority is now, because we know that's what's going to improve learning for our kids.
Thank you very much, Michael. We'll be back in a moment. I can understand why some citizens question the attitude of educators like myself about school rankings. Many teachers, professors, and school administrators have spoken on Your Education Matters against the rankings of British Columbia's schools, as they are done by manipulating FSA scores. During my 10 years in BC, the debate around school ranking has dominated education reporting, along with the issue of whether our schools are adequately funded. As analysis, I would like to say that professional judgment often is puzzling or counterintuitive to laypersons. I find myself in the same position when the roles are reversed and I deal with a medical professional, a lawyer, or an engineer. Like many of you, I'm the type of person who does ask questions and attempts to participate in decisions that profoundly affect my life. On the other hand, my ultimate option is to go along or get another opinion. It is extremely rare that on my own I have the expertise to simply override or dismiss the opinion of a professional in their field of expertise. When I do, I tend to be wrong. At a point, the decision to go forward becomes a matter of trust. After I have done my due diligence, I must put myself in the hands of the expert I have retained. It does make me feel more confidence that they have university and government bona fides regarding their competence and character. To this point in my life, I have rarely been disappointed. In fact, I have been served extremely well. All this applies to each of you, your students and the educators of the province. Teaching may seem transparent and intuitive, but it is not. There is a great deal happening between teachers and students, and also the work principals do to make a healthy school. By any measure, even by standardized tests, BC has a public school system that is among the very best. Some of the strongest evidence of this claim is OECD's testing program, PISA, which is administered in 65 nations every 3 years. Repeatedly, Canada is the highest-ranked English-speaking nation in the world, and Canada is the highest-ranked multicultural country in the world. BC is at or above the average of Canadian provinces, even given our special demographic challenges, including childhood poverty. If we listen to the educators who have created and maintain our public schools, we shall be better served than if we listen to amateurs and public relations persons whose expertise and motivations are suspect. Many of these self-appointed experts have conflicts of interest or are using unfair criticisms of the public schools as a means of gaining political or economic advantage. By their work with our children, our education professionals have earned the public's trust. Thank you for thinking about Your Education Matters. Visit our archive at youreducationmatters.ca.